Your grandfather could tell you an engine was dying just by touching the hood with 2 fingers. Today's mechanics need a laptop. Here are the 33 tricks they took to the grave. Number 33. The penny in the tire tread. But not the way you think. Everybody's grandpa checked tread with Lincoln's head. But the real trick wasn't the penny, it was the angle. You laid the penny sideways, not upright, and watched which direction the copper caught the light unevenly across the tread. An uneven catch meant the frame was tweaked, not just the tires worn. A bent axle hiding behind a simple tread check. A tire man in Akron in 1959 caught crash-damaged frames this way for customers who swore their car had never been in an accident. And he was right, more than the insurance adjusters were. Radial tires and computer alignment racks made the trick obsolete by the late 1970s because the tires stopped wearing honest. The penny never lied, the car did. Number 32. Starting a flooded engine with your foot flat to the floor, backwards. This one sounds insane, and that's exactly why it worked. When a carbureted engine flooded, the instinct was to pump the gas. The old trick was the opposite. You held the pedal all the way to the floor and cranked it, holding it there through the coughing, because a wide-open throttle let in enough air to clear the drowned cylinders instead of drowning them further. A farmer outside Wichita in 1961 taught his son this before he taught him to drive. Because a flooded truck on a cold morning meant a missed sunrise and a missed day's work. Fuel injection made the whole problem disappear by the mid-1980s, and with it, the trick nobody needed to explain twice. The engine wasn't choking on gas, it was choking on the fear of giving it more. Number 31. Curing a dead battery with a cigarette and nothing else. Not the smoke, the heat. Old mechanics knew a battery that wouldn't turn over on a freezing morning wasn't always dead, it was just cold, and cold acid moves slow. You'd wrap a lit cigarette or a rag heated over the manifold around the battery casing for a few minutes before you ever touched the terminals, warming the acid enough to wake it back up. A gas station owner in Duluth in 1957 saved half his morning jump starts this way, before jumper cables were standard equipment in every trunk. Maintenance-free sealed batteries in the 1980s changed the chemistry enough that the trick stopped being reliable, and nobody bothered explaining why. The battery wasn't broken, it was just asleep. If you remember a grandfather, a father, or a neighbor who could do any of this, drop his name in the comments below. Tell us what he taught you. And if you want the next 30 of these before they're gone for good, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're bringing one of these back every single week. Number 30. Judging oil pressure by the sound of the starter alone. Before the gauge even settled, a good mechanic already knew. A healthy engine's starter had a certain bark to it, quick, tight, decisive. A starter that dragged half a second longer than it should meant the oil had thickened overnight, or a bearing was starting to wear loose. A Buick dealer in Flint in 1958 could tell you an oil change was 3 weeks overdue from across the shop floor without looking at a single gauge. Digital dash warnings after the 1990s trained drivers to wait for a light instead of listening for a warning. The starter was never just cranking the engine, it was reporting on it. Number 29. The coat hanger trigger fix for a stuck choke. A stuck choke stranded more people on cold mornings than any other single part, and half of them never needed a tow. You popped the air cleaner, found the choke plate frozen shut with old varnish, and tapped it free with the bent end of a coat hanger, working it gently until it swung loose on its own spring. A traveling salesman in 1963 kept a hanger folded in his glove box specifically for this, because a dead choke on a rural highway before cell phones meant walking. Electronic choke systems phased the whole problem out by 1980, and an entire generation of drivers never learned what a choke plate even looked like. The fix cost nothing. The tow truck cost $12. Real money in 1963. Number 28. Silencing a lifter tick with a can of Marvel Mystery Oil. And patience, not replacement. A ticking lifter today gets an engine teardown quote. In 1960, it got a quart of thin oil and a sundae. You'd pour it straight into the crankcase, let the engine idle for 20 minutes, and let the solvents in the oil work the varnish loose from the lifter bore. A retired Navy mechanic in Norfolk swore by it for every noisy lifter that rolled into his driveway, because he'd learned it fixing engines at sea where a new part wasn't an option for 6 weeks. Roller lifters in modern engines made the whole trick irrelevant by the 1990s. But on the flat tappet engines it was built for, it worked more often than it had any right to. Nobody believed a can of oil could fix a mechanical problem. It usually did. Number 27. Checking a fan belt's tension with a bare thumb. Not a gauge. You pressed your thumb down in the middle of the longest span of belt, and if it gave about half an inch, it was right. Too tight, and it wore out the water pump bearing early. Too loose, and it slipped and squealed on cold mornings and killed the charging system quietly, 1 weak amp at a time. A gas station attendant in Omaha in 1955 checked every belt on every fill-up without being asked, because a stranded driver on Route 30 in July was bad for everyone's day. Serpentine belts with automatic tensioners in the 1990s made the thumb test obsolete overnight. The thumb wasn't measuring rubber, it was measuring how much trouble was coming. Number 26. Diagnosing a bad ground with a single test light and nothing else. Electrical gremlins terrified most drivers and most mechanics too, but the old-timers had one trick that solved half of them. You clipped a simple 12-volt test light to a known good ground and touched it to every suspect connection in the circuit. If the bulb dimmed even slightly, that connection was the thief. An auto-electric shop in Newark in 1964 fixed more unfixable wiring problems with a $5 test light than the next shop over fixed with a full wiring diagram. Modern multiplexed wiring systems buried ground so deep by the 2000s that the simple light stopped being enough. The bulb never argued with you. It just told you where the current was hiding. Number 25. The long screwdriver used as a stethoscope. The first tool an old mechanic reached for wasn't a wrench. It was a screwdriver pressed to the valve cover with the handle against the bone behind his ear. A tick rode up the steel and meant a lifter. A knock came deeper and meant a bearing. An apprentice in a Georgia barn in 1959 got handed a screwdriver before he ever touched a wrench and swept the floor a week longer if he couldn't name the sound. The $400 chassis ear that eventually replaced it actually hears less. It was never really a tool. It was an ear with a steel handle. Number 24. Reading the spark plug's porcelain in the sunlight. This wasn't a diagnostic step. It was reading the engine's diary. You held the white insulator up to daylight. Light tan meant the mixture was right. Black meant it was running rich. Chalky white meant it was lean, and a valve was about to burn through. A country mechanic in 1956 trusted that plug over a customer who swore up and down his car ran just fine while it was quietly burning oil underneath him. Every American V8, built between 1955 and 1975, was engineered to be read exactly this way, and OBD2 sealed that window shut for good in 1996. The plug was never just a part, it was a witness that couldn't be talked out of the truth. Number 23. The vacuum gauge and the dance of its needle. One $5 gauge could read 30 different faults off a single port on the manifold. A steady needle meant a healthy engine. A flicker meant a burned valve. A slow drift meant a vacuum leak somewhere hidden. A rhythmic swing meant a blown head gasket announcing itself early. A shop owner in 1958 made his apprentices call the fault out loud before the needle even finished settling, training their eyes the way a doctor trains for an X-ray. That $5 gauge named problems a $4,000 scan tool still struggles to isolate today. It never diagnosed the engine on its own. It just helped a man hear what the engine was already confessing. Number 22. Reading the oil with nothing but a thumb and a nose. No gauge, just the dipstick and your own senses. You'd wipe a smear of oil between two fingers, feel for grit, then smell it. Sweet meant coolant was getting in. Raw gasoline meant a flooding carburetor was thinning the oil out. A burnt stink meant it had run dangerously hot. A truck driver in 1962 caught a cracking cylinder head by smell alone at a fuel stop, weeks before it would have stranded him 200 miles from anywhere. This was standard practice before the self-serve pump killed the full service bay for good in the 1970s. The gauge only measured the level. The nose was the one that caught the death sentence. Number 21. Reading the tailpipe with a bare finger. The exhaust pipe was a confession written in vapor and soot. You'd run a finger just inside the tip and look at what came back. Dry gray meant a clean burn. Black soot meant it was running rich. Oily black meant it was burning oil. White steam meant coolant was leaking into the cylinders. An Esso station man in 1955 could sell the right tune-up before the driver even opened his mouth. Not to pad the bill, but because the pipe had already told him the truth the driver didn't know yet. Catalytic converters, mandatory by 1975, scrubbed the exhaust clean and took that diagnosis away with it. The driver could argue all he wanted. The pipe never once lied to him. Number 20. The wet compression test that told rings from valves with one squirt of oil. You ran a standard dry compression test first, then squirted a small shot of oil directly into the cylinder and tested it again. If the number jumped up significantly, the piston rings were worn. If it stayed just as low, the valves were the real problem. A rebuilder in Ohio in 1957 used this simple trick to keep honest men from paying for a full valve job when all they needed were rings, or the other way around. The procedure sat printed in every shop manual, clear through the 1970s, before it quietly thinned out of the books as engines became disposable. It wasn't a teardown, it was a single dollar of oil that made the teardown unnecessary. Number 19. Setting valve lash by feel, with nothing but a feeler gauge. Before hydraulic lifters spread through every engine in America, valves were adjusted entirely by hand. You slid a thin steel blade between the rocker arm and the valve stem until it dragged with one faint, even resistance. Then locked the adjustment down right there. Too tight burned a valve within weeks. Too loose hammered the whole valve train to an early death. A Polish mechanic working the line in 1950s Detroit would hand an apprentice the blade and say 4 words: set them, drive it, come back. And that was the whole lesson. Hydraulic lifters sealed that adjustment away for good by the 1970s, and a craft that lived entirely in the fingertips went quiet. The blade never measured the gap, his fingers did. Number 18. Setting the ignition points and dwell by meter, not by guess. A weak spark didn't kill an engine all at once. It killed it slowly, one missed cylinder at a time. You'd set the point gap with a feeler gauge, then dial the dwell angle to the exact center of spec, using a small meter clipped to the distributor. Too little dwell, and the engine missed under load. Too much, and the points themselves burned out early. A tune-up man in 1958 dwelled every engine that came through his bay, even the ones nobody had complained about yet, refusing to let a quiet problem grow into a dead one. Electronic ignition sealed that whole job inside a sealed module by the mid-1970s. The spark lit the fire. The dwell decided how clean it burned. Number 17. Setting the timing by ear. Under load, on the open road. The timing light set it cold in the driveway. His ear set it where the engine actually lived. Under a hill, under a load, under real driving. You'd time it cold with the light first, then drive hard up a grade and listen closely for the marbles in a can rattle of detonation. The instant you heard it, you eased the timing back a hair. A mechanic outside Chattanooga in 1956 tuned every engine this way because his customers drove up mountain roads with their whole families in the car, and detonation they couldn't hear was quietly eating their pistons alive. Computer-controlled timing took that knob away entirely by the early 1980s. The light set the timing cold. His ear set it true. Number 16. Repacking the front wheel bearings by hand, in the palm of your hand. A dry bearing seized without warning at highway speed. A properly packed one ran 1,000,000 miles without complaint. You washed the old hardened grease completely out, then dragged the bearing back and forth through a fresh glob of grease held in your own palm until it pushed clean out the far side, then set the preload entirely by feel. A garage man in 1960 repacked his regular customers' bearings every single spring for free because he'd once seen a seized bearing throw a family into a ditch and never forgot it. Sealed, throwaway hubs arrived in the 1980s, which in practice just meant lubed until failure instead of lubed for life. It was never the grease that saved the bearing. It was the hand that packed it in. Number 15. Setting the carburetor idle mixture by vacuum and finishing it by ear. A quarter turn of a tiny screw was the entire difference between a smooth idle and a rough one. You'd turn each mixture screw slowly, watching for the highest, steadiest vacuum reading, feeling the idle lift as the mixture came right, then stumble the second you'd gone too far past it. A station mechanic in 1962 could set that mixture by sound alone, no gauge required, telling a lean stumble from a rich lope the same way you'd know the cough of someone you loved. Fuel injection erased the mixture screw entirely after 1981. The gauge gave him a number. His ear gave him the truth. Number 14. Lapping the valves to a true seat by hand. This is what kept worn-out engines holding good compression long past when anyone expected them to quit. You'd smear grinding compound thin across the valve face and spin it against its seat with a suction cup tool until a clean, unbroken gray ring appeared all the way around, then wash every trace of grit away before it ever touched a bearing. A rebuilder in 1956 lapped valves the way a man hones a good knife, slow and even, and wouldn't be rushed for any amount of money. Hardened valve seats and unleaded gasoline ended the art by the mid-1970s. The compound cut the metal. His patience cut it true. Number 13. Sealing a small exhaust leak with nothing but wire and furnace cement. A backyard fix that regularly outlasted a professional muffler shop weld. You'd pack the leak tight with high-heat furnace cement, then wrap the whole area with safety wire while the cement was still soft, and the wire held the patch firm as it baked rock hard against the hot pipe. A country mechanic in 1953 kept a cigar box of wire and cement in his shed, $2 all in, and kept a neighbor's exhaust quiet for years at a time. This was roadside knowledge from an era before shops would only ever offer you a full new muffler. It was never a weld, it was patience, wrapped tight in wire. Number 12. Greasing every chassis fitting on the car. On a strict schedule, 10 minutes of work saved an entire front end from an early grave. You'd find every single grease fitting, tie rods, ball joints, kingpins, U-joints, and push fresh grease into each one until the old, dirty grease squeezed out clean around the edges. A garage man in 1959 greased his regular customers' cars for free because a dry ball joint could let go without any warning at 50 miles an hour with kids in the back seat. Sealed, lubed for life joints arrived through the 1970s, which too often just meant lubed until they quietly failed. It was never the part that wore out first. It was the 10 minutes nobody spends anymore. Number 11. Cutting open the used oil filter to read the metal caught inside. The filter caught everything the engine had shed that month, and almost nobody ever looked. You'd cut the can open with tin snips and spread the pleated paper flat in good light. Fine gray paste was totally normal wear. Bright metal flakes meant a bearing was starting to fail, and actual glitter meant real trouble was coming fast. A fleet mechanic in 1957 cut open every single filter he pulled, because a caught bearing meant a Saturday repair, while a missed one meant a stranded truck on a mountain pass. As engines became sealed and disposable, nobody bothered opening what the filter had caught anymore. The filter was never trash. It was the engine's confession, for anyone willing to open it up. Number 10. Reading the magnetic drain plug at every single oil change. A magnet built into the drain plug pulled the iron particles straight out of the draining oil, and those shavings told the whole story of the engine's health. You'd wipe the plug clean and hold it up to the light. Fine gray fuzz was normal. Bright slivers meant it was worth watching closely, and heavy flakes meant a bearing was actively failing. A mechanic in 1955 caught a dying engine 4 full months early, off nothing but the fuzz clinging to a drain plug, while the owner laughed it off at the time. The quick lube model that took over in the 1980s drained the oil fast and never once looked at what came out. The plug was never just a part. It was a witness that got ignored. Number 9. Freeing a stuck valve or lifter with the right oil and real patience. A noise most shops today simply answer with a quote for a new engine. You'd run a flush of light oil through the crankcase, then a good detergent oil behind it, and let the engine idle warm while working the throttle gently to wash the built-up varnish loose. By the next morning, more often than not, the tick was simply gone. A neighborhood mechanic in 1961 saved a widow's only car this way for the price of a routine oil change, when a shop across town had quoted her a full rebuild she could never have afforded. As engines turned disposable, this cheap cure got quietly forgotten, mostly because the rebuild always paid better than the fix. Number 8. Warming the engine fully before ever draining the oil. Hot oil carries the dirt straight out with it. Cold oil leaves half of that dirt sitting behind in the pan. You'd run the engine all the way up to full operating temperature before ever pulling the drain plug, because warm oil ran thin and fast and carried the grit and sludge out along with it. A Hudson dealer's mechanic in 1957 flatly refused to drain a man's oil until the engine had idled a full 4 minutes, telling him plainly, "Drain it cold, and half the dirt just stays in there." The quick lube model drains it cold to save 2 minutes of labor time. Hot oil leaves an engine clean. Cold oil leaves the dirt sitting right where it started. Number 7. Letting the oil drain the full 10 minutes, never the rushed 90 seconds. This was patience. A modern shop simply cannot afford to sell you anymore. You'd pull the plug and just walk away, letting every last drop of old oil weep slowly out of the pan on its own time. A rushed drain always left a cup or more of filthy old oil behind to immediately foul the fresh fill going back in. A fleet mechanic in 1965 timed every single drain by his coffee cup, and the Chevy he serviced this way for years logged over 600,000 miles on its original, untouched bottom end. A coupon shop simply cannot leave a car up on the rack that long and still make its margin. The fresh oil was never really the problem, it was the old oil he chose to leave behind. Number 6. Changing the very first oil fill at 500 miles, never waiting for 3,000. The break-in miles carried the dirt that quietly killed young engines early. A brand new engine shed real metal shavings and casting sand grit in its very first miles, grinding every single bearing surface it touched along the way. You'd drain that first oil early, cut the filter open to read exactly what it caught, and refill with clean oil before any real damage set in. A mechanic in 1957 did this directly against the factory's printed schedule, because he'd torn down enough young engines to know exactly what those very first miles left behind inside them. Extended drain intervals buried this habit completely by the 1990s. The factory manual said 3,000 miles. The engine itself said 500. He chose to believe the engine. Number 5. Priming the oil and watching pressure climb before the car ever moved an inch. The first dry seconds after any oil change did more real damage than the next 1,000 miles combined. After every oil change, you'd stand at the gauge and watch the needle climb steadily, while the lifters quieted down as oil finally reached the very top of the engine, and only then would you let the car move at all. A mobile station owner in 1956 refused to release a customer's car for a full 60 seconds after any oil change, and a Ford engineer later told him personally it was the single most important thing he did all day. The modern drive-through quick lube model puts raw speed first, every time. The first turn of a properly primed engine is gentle. The first turn of a dry one is a wound that never fully heals. Number 4. Driving the very first mile gently after every cold start. This was never really a technical rule. It was a discipline a mechanic taught, and a driver kept for himself out of respect. You simply didn't floor it pulling out of the driveway. You drove that first mile gently, giving the oil time to reach every bearing, while the metal slowly warmed to its proper clearances. For a man in 1965 who had saved for 8 straight years just to afford his first brand new car, that gentle first mile was pure respect for a machine bought with real overtime and money he hadn't spent on anything else. Modern drivers floor it stone cold and then wonder, years later, why their timing chain is stretching at 80,000 miles. It was never technical knowledge at all. It was gratitude, expressed in mechanical form. Number 3. The complete hand tune-up, start to finish, in under an hour. Points, plugs, condenser, timing, dwell, and mixture, all set by one single man in well under 60 minutes flat. You'd replace the points, plugs, and condenser, set the dwell, time it precisely with a light, and then refine the whole thing further by ear, with every single adjustment feeding directly into the next. A station mechanic in 1968 did the entire job for $14.95, while you waited in the chair, his hands moving through the whole procedure, almost without his eyes needing to follow along. The feedback carburetor arrived in 1981, and OBD2 sealed the rest away completely by 1996. It was never really a service he was performing. It was one man telling an engine he had genuinely been paying attention to it. Number 2. The weekly walk-around every mechanic taught the owner to keep for himself. The single best mechanic alive cannot save an engine whose owner is quietly running it straight into the ground. You'd check the oil and the coolant every single week without fail. You'd look over the belts, you'd look down at the ground where the car had sat parked overnight. A single drop of oil there meant something worth noting. A full puddle meant the week's plan had just changed entirely. A garage man in 1958 sent every single customer home with this exact habit, treating the driver himself as the engine's very first line of defense. AAA found back in 1968 that drivers who inspected their own cars weekly suffered far fewer roadside breakdowns than those who didn't. The mechanic made the engine sound to begin with. The habit was what kept it that way for years afterward. Number 1. Listening to the engine before you ever put it in gear. That's the entire trick. Before you ever backed out of the driveway, you sat there for 10 full seconds and just listened. You started it and didn't move an inch. The idle was either steady or it simply wasn't. A faint miss, a slight roughness, one unfamiliar tick, and you caught the problem before you ever rolled a single foot. Most mornings, absolutely nothing was wrong at all. But every single breakdown in the entire history of the automobile announced itself first, to someone willing to listen. Your grandfather did this without ever calling it anything at all. He just called it noticing. 10 seconds, every single morning. For 50 straight years, And he never once waited on a shoulder for a tow truck that wasn't coming fast enough. We replaced that ear with a check engine light. And the light, it turns out, is always the very last thing to speak, never the first.